Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for a special edition of Inside Immigration. Today we're joined by Senior Associate Cristina Guida and Permanent Residence Practice Director Hilete Stein. Please feel free to ask any questions through the pop-up text bar on your screen, and we'll do our best to address your questions at the end of the webinar. If the panelists do not get to your question, you can contact them through the information provided on screen or by reaching out to me directly at info@gans.com. And with that being said, I'll hand things over to our panelists.
Thank you, Stephen. So we're going to start off today talking about the historic express entry draw, which we saw on February 13th, so just over a week ago, which was the 176th express entry draw since the system was established back in 2015. So why was this a historic draw? Now, we had in this draw the largest number of invitations ever issued under the express entry system, as well as the lowest CRS cutoff score, which was sort of the lowest score that a candidate required to receive an invitation under the system since the program was created back in January of 2015. The number of invitations that we saw issued this draw was 27,332 invitations, and the cutoff score dropped down to 75 points, which is significantly lower than the trend that we had been seeing over the past year, which was around 450 points and up. So just sort of for some context for people who are not familiar with the system, before this express entry draw, the highest number of invitations that were issued in any given round of invitations was 5,000 invitations, and that was back in November and December of 2020. And the absolute lowest score we ever saw in terms of the Canadian experience class or the federal skilled worker class was 413 points, and that was back in May of 2017. So this was quite different than what we have seen with this program in the past. And what it means essentially is that almost everybody who was sitting in the express entry pool on February 13th and had accumulated 1 year of Canadian work experience in the last 3 years was invited to apply for permanent residence. So essentially it cleared out the pool of candidates who met this the Canadian Experience Class program. So this really was a monumental shift for the program that was originally designed to target only the top ranking candidates in the pool. And what we've seen from this is now the focus has shifted to target candidates who are already in Canada. So why this sudden increase in the number of invitations issued, this shift? Well, we look back to October of 2020, and in October of 2020, Immigration released the 2021 to 2023 Immigration Levels Plan. And that plan really set out to increase the immigration targets for the next 3 years to help the Canadian economy recover from COVID-19, to drive future growth, and to create jobs for Canadians. And, you know, we saw in 2020 that only about 184,000 new permanent residents were added to Canada, which was well short of the intended target for 2020 of 341,000. So really what the government is doing is they're aiming to welcome 401,000 new permanent residents to Canada in 2021 to make up for the shortfall that we saw in 2020. And about 108,000 of those are aiming to come from the economic classes to recover this shortfall. But we have an issue where there's ongoing travel restrictions related to the pandemic. And we'll touch on these a little bit later in our webinar. And so because of these travel restrictions, you have permanent resident applicants who were actually approved, but were approved after March 18th of 2020, who can't travel to Canada to actually complete the landing process and become permanent residents unless they meet some of the exemptions, such as they maybe were sponsored by an immediate family member or are currently living in the US and plan to come here to settle permanently. So really, to meet the immigration targets for 2021, IRCC needed to facilitate permanent residence for foreign nationals who are already in Canada. And that's really what we've seen with this most recent draw, as sort of a first step towards meeting that target. And hopefully, we're hoping that we will see future changes to facilitate immigration for other foreign nationals in Canada as well. So we have, a lot of self-employed people who maybe have been working for their own businesses, established their own companies. They would not have qualified in this most recent draw because their Canadian work experience would not count towards the CEC class. We've got international students who are already living and studying here, parents who are here on super visas. So the hope is that this is really just sort of a first step to facilitate immigration for people who are already in Canada. Now, we have seen some unintended consequences as a result of this sort of surprise large draw. One of which is, there's a big question mark right now about what will happen with the provincial programs, because this draw effectively eliminated most of the use for the express entry provincial nomination streams, as most of the candidates who would have used these streams to kind of boost their express entry score with the additional 600 points for the provincial nomination would have been now invited under the most recent draw. So they may no longer need to use those streams, and so we may see further changes in the provincial programs to meet the provincial immigration targets as well. We've seen anecdotally as well that some panel physicians have been overwhelmed with appointments since the last draw, in particular outside of the Greater Toronto area, because the panel physicians have to, spread out appointments and things like that. And so, this is sort of an anecdotal unintended consequence that maybe wasn't foreseen. We've seen a bit of a technology impact where candidates who tried to create profiles last week after the draw were having delays in receiving their confirmation of submission for new profiles. And then a big question we've had is what's going to happen to the processing time. So previously under express entry, the government had indicated an estimated processing time of 6 months. We don't know whether that 6-month target will be able to continue to be met. But again, the hope is that in having this draw in an attempt to meet the immigration targets for 2021, that hopefully these candidates will be landed by the end of this year. And then, another question that's come up as well is what's the message that this draw sends to people in the federal skilled worker class who are outside of Canada? Is Canada sort of closed to those people for the year? And, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case, but there has to be this balancing between the travel restrictions that are in place and facilitating immigration as well. So what can we expect moving forward? Will there be another draw with such a low score and such high numbers? Or when will the next express entry draw be? So in the past, the draws were, typically every 2 to 3 weeks. We don't know whether their candidates who are creating profiles now will have to wait a little bit longer before we see more express entry draws. But I think, the key takeaway from this is that candidates who previously may not have scored high enough to get invited, this is now a good option for them, and they should be creating profiles to get into the system, with the understanding that this is sort of where IRCC is looking to meet their targets for the coming year. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Cristina, who's going to talk to you about some of the latest travel restrictions.
Thanks, Hilete. Just to continue off of the issues related to permanent residency, one of the things I know I got tons of calls for were people in the federal skilled trades. So I have tons of people that they don't quite meet the language requirements as needed for the CEC draw. So they're very curious to know, what's going to be done for them. And I keep encouraging my clients, make sure you do your English language test, continue to practice so you can get that CLB of 7 to qualify under the CEC. But as we've heard from the minister himself, he said that there's new pathways that will be introduced at some point, specifically for people in the trade. So we're hopeful for them and that they'll get consideration as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in other exciting news in February, it's been a very eventful month. We only have I think this year is only 28 days, but yet we have a lot of news. So from the last time we spoke on our webinar, obviously the travel ban restrictions have been extended for another month, and in some cases 2. So the travel ban between Canada and other countries other than the US, the travel ban has been extended until the 21st of April. And then the travel ban between Canada and the US has been extended until March 21st of 2021. So that means the status quo in terms of who's able to travel into Canada, it's non-optional, non-discretionary travel, reuniting with family members, all the same things we've seen since basically March of last year when the travel restrictions were in place. So nothing in that regard has changed, but lots of things have changed in regards to what happens when you do make your way to Canada, and specifically with the quarantine requirements. So I'm sure all of us who follow the news have seen tons of media reports as to what's going on. So the simplest way for me to summarize what's going on is this. And I've put it in a few bullet points just so it's easy to follow. So for land crossings and for or air crossings, or basically airports and land crossings, everyone needs to show proof of a negative COVID-19 test before arriving in Canada, and that test has to have been administered and receive the results within 72 hours of boarding a flight to Canada. Again, if the traveler has tested positive for COVID and continues to test positive for COVID, then they have to provide proof that they've done that test, their COVID-19 test 14 to 90 days before boarding the flight to Canada. The other major change that has happened both at air crossings and land crossings is the Arrive Can app. So anyone who was flying into Canada, that was an absolute requirement for some time now, but that's also required now for land crossings for everybody. And the app requires you to implement your quarantine details. So your location, your details of quarantine, including your address, transportation to your place of quarantine, and arrangements for food and other necessities. And then the big change that we're seeing is that before you're able to board that flight to Canada, you have to have the reservations at the government approved hotel. So that is where a lot of the confusion has happened since Monday, so when all of these changes were implemented. So before you arrive at the airport, you have to make a booking and have a booking at the 3-day hotel quarantine. Well, you have to have the booking at the 3-day hotel for the purposes of when you arrive in Canada, you have to do a COVID-19 test. So when you come into Canada, you do the COVID-19 test, and then you will be transferred to that hotel for the 3-day period, waiting for the results of the COVID-19 test, and then you can resume the rest of your quarantine, the rest of the 14-day quarantine at your place of quarantine. So as a reminder, everyone is still required to quarantine for a 14-day period. It's just the first 3 days will have to be done at the hotel, at a maximum 3 days at the hotel, and then the remaining will have to be done at your place of quarantine. And then the last bit of information, or the last bit of requirement, is that you will have to do a 10-day, at the 10-day mark, you will have to do another COVID-19 test. So you will be provided with kits when you're arriving into Canada to do that. And these requirements are the same whether you're flying into Canada or you're crossing at a land border. Land borders, however, do not require the 3-day quarantine period at the mandatory hotel, but all the other requirements are in place. there are a few exceptions to these quarantine requirements and the testing requirements. So as always, quarantine is mandatory unless you fall into one of the essential categories, as has been in place since the beginning. There are no exceptions to the COVID-19 test for boarding a flight. That's an absolute requirement, as is the 3-night hotel stay requirement. So for essential workers, in order for you to board your flight, they're going to need the test results, and they're going to want to see the 3-night hotel stay requirement. Now, the hotel stay requirement is a gray area as of right now because the regulations are a bit unclear. So what it doesn't look like they need it, but the airline officials are looking for it. So our advice to our clients is make sure you have the booking, and then you can cancel it later. The caveat with this is that cancellations and any bookings with the hotels is between you and the hotel. So if there's any refunds or anything like that, make sure that you're making those inquiries before you're doing the booking, because that will be helpful in making sure that you can get your money back. The same goes if you are required to do the 3-day hotel quarantine. If you get your test results back, let's say 1 day after your arrival or 2 days after, inquire with the hotels to see if you can get a refund of your money. Although you've done the 3-night booking, see if you can get some of your money back in that regard. And then for land boarders, the hotel quarantine requirement isn't required, but everyone must do the pre-arrival COVID testing as a reminder, unless you fall into one of their categories like a cross-border worker. So those are the people that have to cross on a daily basis, who live, let's say, in Windsor and cross into Detroit, etc. So be mindful of that, but just know that, you know, when we're coming into Canada and traveling to Canada these days, we're going to have to pack a lot of patience and, you know, have as much lead time as possible when making arrangements to travel to Canada, specifically because of the 3-day hotel quarantine. We have, since it was implemented on Monday, the government started taking bookings as of Friday, and there's been tons of delays. People have been on hold. You know, it's been taking, some clients have told me, up to 20 hours. So make sure that you're giving yourself as much lead time as possible. Pack your patience, because the bookings can only be done through the telephone. So there is a designated 1-800 number, and then if you're overseas, there's a designated 613 area code number that you can call. The good thing is that if you're calling from overseas, there are no long distance charges. They are allowing it to be collect calls, so that's a nice thing on their part. But make sure you're packing your patience in regards to that. As a reminder, the flights into Canada are only coming in through 4 of the major airports. So that's Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and Montreal. So again, the designated hotel quarantine and the hotels are going to be only in those 4 cities, and there's a designated list online for each of the cities. So make sure you call those hotels in advance to do your bookings, and again, make all the inquiries related to refunds, you know, transportation and stuff like that. All that information is being dealt with directly with the hotel booking. So as you can see, there's been lots of changes, you know, from the PR perspective and also from entry into Canada. So some exciting news from the PR portion of things, and, you know, just a bit more, a few more things when it comes to traveling to Canada. But you know, people are still traveling. Business is still, you know, Canada is still open to an extent. It's just, again, it's about traveling when you're making your traveling arrangements to make sure that you're doing it with as much lead time as possible and as much patience as you can.
I think also, Cristina, we want to make sure to, you know, before you travel, to check in to make sure that there haven't been more changes, because the changes seem to be coming, you know, almost weekly, if not, you know,
daily. Yeah. So as a caveat, the information we're giving you today may change tomorrow, but as always, we keep our clients updated. If you've registered for our alerts, and we make sure that we let everybody know what's going on. But as indicated, yeah, if you do have travel plans and you're making plans, inquire with us, inquire with your immigration team, and make sure you know what the requirements are at the time of travel. So I think at this point we can open it up to question period.
Okay, so I'll touch on the first one. What do we see CEC in the future? Is it going to stay on the new trend? You know, are there going to be changes to the program? What do we think in terms of an investor program? You know, again, I think it's been quite clear from the most recent express entry draw that, you know, we should expect to see immigration being facilitated for individuals who have the 1 year of Canadian work experience, as well as individuals who are already in Canada, at least for the next year. Exactly what those programs will look like is still yet to be seen, but you know, the hope is there are a number of categories which were not touched on in this draw for Canadian experience class, where you know, you do have individuals with work experience or study experience in Canada, that hopefully their immigration will be facilitated in the coming year as well.
Okay, so the good news is we can see here from one of the questions, and thank you for the feedback about essential service providers. So it's good to hear that CBSA and everyone allowed you to, it's not clear if they allowed you to board the plane without the 3-day booking, but yes, you are exempt from the 3-day booking if you are an essential service provider, or for the quarantine period, because again, as I mentioned before, if you don't have to quarantine or you're exempt from quarantine because you fall within the designated class of essential workers assisting in regards to critical infrastructure, then yes, you don't have to do the 3-day hotel quarantine.
Okay, so there's a question on CEC. Do we advise clients to create an express entry profile before completing the 1 year of work experience in Canada? So it really depends. There are clients who may meet the federal skilled worker criteria, but they haven't quite hit their 1 year under the Canadian experience class. For those individuals, I would advise to create the profile as soon as they're eligible to go into the pool. And basically what that does is it gives these individuals an opportunity to be selected should the criteria change. And if not, then they would be in the pool once they hit their 1 year of Canadian work experience and qualify for the Canadian experience class. You know, in the past, we have seen that individuals do get credit about a month prior to meeting their 1 year work anniversary, with the idea being that they will get invited, and by the time they submit their PR application, they'll meet that 1 year criteria for which they're awarded points. So yes, I absolutely advise clients, you know, as soon as you meet the criteria to go into the pool, you should be creating your profile, especially if you're already in Canada.
Yes. And we have a question here about whether employers are expected to cover the cost of the 3-day mandatory hotel quarantine for foreign nationals. That's an individual, you know, decision between the employer and the employee. As an employer, the regulations do require that you pay the individual during the period of during the quarantine period. So for that 2-week period, you are required to pay wages as per the regulations, but in terms of who's covering the cost for the hotel, that is an individual decision. But if you have specific questions related to a specific candidate, feel free to reach out to us and we can give you a more specific answer to that.
Okay, I see a question here regarding part-time work experience while studying. and whether that can be added under the Canadian experience class or under the express entry system. So unfortunately, if you do work while you're studying, you would not get points for that work experience as part of the express entry process.
There is a question about whether you can get an extension of your postgraduate work permit due to COVID. So there were new announcements in regards to that, I believe earlier on this month or late last month. So yes, there are certain criteria that does allow an individual to extend their postgraduate work permit. So if you want to reach out to us to do an assessment of whether that's an option, please feel free to reach out and we'll address that on an individual basis.
There's a question as well about if there's a way to circumvent the telephone booking for the mandatory. Fortunately, at this point, there is not, and we'll see. There could be still changes on that, you know, in the future. But for now, unfortunately, no. It's only
yeah. We were hopefully we get online bookings at some point, but at this point, it is only the the phone call bookings. Some of the tips that our clients provided is at the 3-hour mark, it's best to just disconnect and put yourself back in queue, because at some point they do drop off the calls. So again, it's all about patience. It's a long process, and unfortunately it's required at this point.
Okay, so Cristina, I think that's all the questions for today, and I guess we'll turn it back over to Stephen.
Thanks, Hilete. Appreciate that. All the questions today. Busy webinar, but unfortunately that is all the time we have for today. I would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and a special thanks to Cristina and Hilete for sharing their expert knowledge. If you would like to discuss any of the topics in more detail, please reach out, book a consultation. Details can be found on screen right now. You can also reach out to me at info@gans.com. I'd also encourage you all to sign up to our alerts and follow us on social media to keep up to date with the latest developments inside Canadian immigration. Until next time, everybody, stay safe.
Thanks.